The Soviet Union fielded over 100 different aircraft types during World War II. Fighters, bombers, ground attack planes, reconnaissance birds, and trainers. Some were legendary workhorses. Others were desperate improvisations. This is every Soviet aircraft that flew against the Nazis. First up, fighters and interceptors. Polikarpov, 1/16. This stubby little monoplane earned the nickname Ishak, or donkey. It was incredibly maneuverable at low altitude and packed a serious punch for its size. Soviet pilots loved it in Spain during the Civil War. But by 1941, it was completely outclassed by German Messerschmitts. Too slow, too fragile, desperately outdated. It still fought through the entire war because there weren't enough modern fighters to replace it. A flying coffin by 1943, but it kept flying anyway. Polikarpov, Y-153, Chaika. The Seagull was a biplane fighter with retractable landing gear. Yes, a biplane in World War II. It could turn on a dime and was beloved by aerobatic pilots. Against modern German fighters, it was a death trap. Slow, undergunned, structurally weak. The Luftwaffe ate these alive over the steppe. Yet thousands flew in the early war because Stalin's purges had gutted Soviet aviation development, obsolete but still in the fight. Yakovlev, Yak-1, the first of the famous Yak fighters, light, nimble, with decent speed and firepower. It could finally go toe-to-toe with Bf-109s at low altitude. The wooden construction saved strategic metals but made it vulnerable to battle damage. Early models suffered quality control nightmares due to rushed production. One good hit and the whole airframe could come apart. It worked when it worked, but Soviet factories were basically assembling these in train stations. Yakovlev, Yak-3, arguably the best low-altitude fighter of the entire war. Lighter than the Yak-1, faster in a dogfight below 15,000 feet, and absolutely lethal in the hands of a decent pilot. German pilots were explicitly warned to avoid engaging Yak-3s below 5,000 meters. The problem was range and high-altitude performance. Above 20,000 feet, it was mediocre. Limited fuel meant short missions. But for air superiority over the battlefield, it was devastating. Yakovlev, Yak-7, started life as a two-seat trainer and got weaponized when the war broke out. Heavier than the Yak-1, slightly less maneuverable, but more robust. It could absorb damage that would shred other Soviet fighters. Pilots appreciated the second seat for conversion training or emergency liaison flights. It bridged the gap between trainers and frontline fighters during the desperate early war period. Not the best, but available when it mattered. Yakovlev, Yak-9, the mass production workhorse, over 16,000 built in multiple variants. Fighter, fighter-bomber, long-range escort, tank buster. It did everything. The Yak-9D had extended range for bomber escort. The Yak-9T mounted a 37 mm cannon that could rip German tanks apart from above. Build quality was inconsistent. Some were excellent. Some fell apart after 50 flight hours. But sheer numbers and adaptability made it the backbone of Soviet fighter aviation. From 1943 onward, it works. Lavochkin, Lend-Lease. Heavy, sluggish, underpowered. Pilots nicknamed it Varnished Guaranteed Coffin because of its lacquered wooden construction. It was supposed to be a modern monoplane fighter. Instead, it was slow, difficult to handle, and caught fire easily. German pilots loved encountering Lend-Lease because they were easy kills. Soviet command kept producing them out of desperation, eventually replaced by better Lavochkin designs. But thousands died in these before that happened. A museum piece forced into frontline service. Lavochkin LA-5, take a Lend-Lease, rip out the terrible inline engine, jam in a massive radial, and suddenly you have a fighter that actually fights. The LA-5 could finally compete with Bf-109s and FW-190s, fast, heavily armed, and tough enough to survive battle damage. The big radial engine up front acted like armor for the pilot, still suffered from poor visibility and heavy controls, but it was legitimately dangerous. Used extensively at Stalingrad and Kursk, it works. Lavochkin, LA-7. The ultimate evolution of the Lavochkin line, Lighter, faster, better armed than the LA-5, top Soviet aces flew this late in the war. 3 20mm cannons gave it brutal firepower. Improved aerodynamics made it competitive even at higher altitudes. The problem was availability. Only elite guards units got them in significant numbers. Production ramped up too late to fully replace older types. When you had one, you had a world-class fighter. Most pilots never did. Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-1, the prototype that started the MiG dynasty. High-altitude interceptor designed to stop German bombers. Fast in a straight line, terrible at turning, the cockpit was cramped, visibility was awful, and it had a nasty tendency to spin out of control. Pilots hated it. Production stopped after about 100 units because it was fundamentally flawed. Still, it laid the groundwork for the far superior MiG-3, Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-3, better than the MiG-1 but still compromised. Excellent high-altitude performance for 1941, above 20,000 feet. It could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe had. The problem was the Eastern Front air war happened at low altitude. Down low, it was sluggish and outmatched. Light armament made it a poor dogfighter. It was built for a war that didn't happen. Thousands were produced anyway. Pilots used them for reconnaissance and high-altitude interception when they could. Outclassed for most missions. Bell P-39 Airacobra. American Lend-Lease fighter. The US didn't want it, the Soviets loved it. The 37mm nose cannon was perfect for ground attack and tank busting. Low-altitude performance was solid, exactly where Soviet pilots fought. The mid-mounted engine made it prone to flat spins if mishandled. American pilots hated that. Soviet pilots trained for it and adapted. It became one of the top Soviet aces' preferred mounts. Dangerous, but in the right hands, lethal. Bell P-63 King Cobra. Improved Airacobra with better performance, faster, more powerful, heavier armed. Most went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, used primarily as a fighter bomber and ground attack aircraft. The big engine and sturdy construction let it survive multiple missions against heavy ground fire. Limited air-to-air use because the Soviets had enough fighters by 1944. Instead, it became a flying artillery piece. It works for what it was used for. Moving on to ground attack aircraft. Il-2 Sturmovik, the most produced military aircraft in history, over 36,000 built. A flying tank designed to destroy German armor and infantry. Heavily armored cockpit, powerful cannons and rockets, brutal effectiveness. Early single-seat models left the rear gunner position empty, making them vulnerable to German fighters. Losses were catastrophic. Stalin personally demanded a rear gunner be added. Two-seat models were far more survivable. Still, life expectancy for Il-2 crews was measured in missions, not months. German troops called it the Black Death. It dominated the battlefield despite horrific losses. Dangerous, effective, irreplaceable. Il-2 Il-10. The improved Sturmovik, better armor, more powerful engine, heavier armament, arrived too late in the war to fully replace the Il-2. Where it did serve, it proved superior in every way, faster, tougher, deadlier. Post-war, it became the standard Soviet ground attack aircraft. But in WT1, it was a late arrival that showed what the Sturmovik could have been from the start. Petlyakov PA-2, a fast, versatile dive bomber that could also serve as a fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, or night bomber. Nicknamed Peshka, it was the Soviet equivalent of the German Ju-88. Wooden construction, decent speed, reasonable bomb load, suffered from poor defensive armament and inadequate armor. Losses were high, especially early in the war. But it was adaptable and available in huge numbers. Crews respected it for being fast enough to sometimes outrun German fighters. It does the job. Petlyakov PA-3, a fighter variant of the PE-2. Heavier guns, no bomb bay, designed to escort bombers or intercept German aircraft. It was mediocre as a fighter, too heavy, not agile enough. Lacked the performance to compete with dedicated fighters, mostly used for night fighting where speed and firepower mattered more than maneuverability. limited production replaced by better fighters. A stopgap that filled a role until proper aircraft arrived. Sukhoi Su-2, a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, intended to replace older biplanes in the ground attack role. Decent payload, reasonable speed, poor defensive armament. The war started before enough were built. Most were destroyed on the ground in the first weeks of Barbarossa. Those that survived served in secondary theaters, structurally sound but tactically obsolete by 1942. A victim of bad timing, continuing with bombers. Tupolev SB, the fast bomber of the late 1930s. In Spain, it outran Republican fighters. By 1941, it was a flying death sentence. Too slow to escape modern German fighters, too lightly built to survive anti-aircraft fire. Used in the desperate early months of the war because there was nothing else. Losses were horrific, relegated to night bombing and reconnaissance when better bombers arrived. Obsolete but still flying. Tupolev Tu-2. One of the best medium bombers of the war. Fast, well-armed, heavily built. It could carry a serious bomb load and defend itself. Rear gunners had decent fields of fire. The problem was production. Design delays and factory prioritization meant it arrived late. Only a few thousand were built during the war. Where it served, it excelled. But most Soviet bomber units never got one. It works when you have it. Petlyakov, PE-8, the only Soviet four-engine heavy bomber, designed to strike deep into German territory. Powerful, long-range, capable of carrying massive bomb loads. Only about 90 were built during the entire war. Production was limited because the Soviet Union prioritized fighters and ground attack aircraft. Maintenance was a nightmare. Losses to German fighters and mechanical failure were high. Used for strategic strikes and special missions, but never in significant numbers. A museum piece pressed into limited service. Ilyushin Il-4, a long-range twin-engine bomber. Originally designed as a naval torpedo bomber, it became the backbone of Soviet long-range aviation, capable of hitting targets deep behind German lines. Lightly armed, vulnerable to fighters but available in decent numbers, used for strategic bombing, mine-laying and torpedo attacks against German shipping. Crews flew brutal missions with minimal fighter escort. It survived because the Luftwaffe couldn't be everywhere, outclassed but irreplaceable. Yermolayev, Year-2, a long-range heavy bomber designed to replace older types. Good performance, solid bomb load, but plagued by engine problems. Production was halted in 1941 to focus on more critical aircraft. A few hundred served in frontline units before being withdrawn, mechanically unreliable and difficult to maintain. A promising design that couldn't overcome wartime production realities. And finally, reconnaissance and liaison aircraft. Polikarpov, PO-2. The immortal biplane. Designed as a trainer in the 1920s, it became the most versatile aircraft of the war. Night bomber, liaison, medevac, reconnaissance, crop duster. Fabric and wood, slow as hell, nearly silent. German fighters couldn't shoot it down because it flew too slow for them to track. Used by the Night Witches, all-female bomber regiments that terrorized German troops. Over 30,000 built. Still flying in some countries today. Obsolete in 1941, irreplaceable by 1945, Yakovlev, Yak-6, a light transport and liaison aircraft, simple, rugged, capable of operating from dirt strips, used to ferry supplies, evacuate wounded, and transport commanders. Not glamorous, but essential for keeping frontline units connected to rear echelon support. Limited production compared to combat types, but valued wherever it served. Lisunov Li-2, Soviet license-built version of the American DC-3, the ultimate transport aircraft, carried troops, supplies, paratroopers, wounded. Some were armed and used as improvised bombers. Reliable, tough, capable of flying in any weather, thousands were built or delivered via Lend-Lease. The logistical backbone of Soviet airlift operations. It works everywhere. Tupolev NT-25, a long-range, record-breaking aircraft from the 1930s. Used for ultra-long-range reconnaissance missions deep into German-held territory. Very few in service, specialized role. Mostly flown by elite crews for strategic intelligence gathering, fragile, difficult to maintain, but unmatched in range for its time. Which Soviet aircraft is your favorite? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for the next video.